I think we need to make a very clear distinction between lesson giving and training. There's a difference. And before we get a kid, and I'm thinking more in terms of kids, but when you read the data on youth sports participation, it's very clear. Those decisions get made very early in life, very early. And so if we're not getting very young kids, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, involved in horses, the likelihood they'll get involved is pretty small.
Bring them in on the rail at a jog, please. On the rail at a jog.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of On the Rail podcast. As we mentioned before, once a month, we're going to be having these roundtable discussions, and today's roundtable is talking about the amateur rule change proposal on allowing amateurs to give lessons for payment. And we have some exciting guests on to just discuss it, see each other's sides, talk about benefits, maybe not so much benefit portion, just have an open discussion and hopefully see things from each perspective. And then you can form your own opinion. And we'll just throw out there that we have no agenda here. We're just bringing about the conversation. We think it's very important. We all want the same thing, which is more participation within our industry. So that's why we're just starting this discussion. So without further ado, I'll have our guests kind of introduce themselves and what their involvement is in the industry, kind of how they got started in the horses, and just a general statement on where you're kind of standing with this rule change proposal. Rachel, if you want to go first.
Sure. So, hey, everybody. My name is Rachel Landman. I am an amateur rider out of North Texas. I have 7 paint horses of my own. I've had paints for the last 20 years, so I bleed APHA. But essentially, I got started in the hunters. I keep a toe dipped in the hunters, but as of 10 years ago, I fully moved over to the stock horse side of the business and the breed shows. I have 3 horses in full training right now. We generally show mostly Texas. I'm hoping to get out to Vegas and Ocala and some of the bigger venues this year, but excited to be a part of this. I'm kind of on the anti-amateurs receiving remuneration for lessons, but we'll get into that as we discuss everything.
Billy or Ashley, whoever wants to go next.
Ashley, you.
Sounds good. My name is Ashley Peterson, and I reside in southern Minnesota. I grew up showing 4-H and open shows, and it wasn't until probably about 10 years ago that I started showing AQHA more full-time. I show mostly at a local scale, kind of in our regional area up here in Minnesota, which we have a pretty short show season. I'm living up here in the tundra, but I'm kind of a do-it-yourselfer, but I also get a lot of help from trainers. I will kind of have a horse in training for a couple months and then bring it home for a few months. Typically, they're at my house more than they're at a trainer's, and then I kind of take lessons in between times as needed and get help at the shows. I stand more on the side that amateurs should not be allowed to give lessons. I do see both sides, and that makes it really difficult for both sides, because they both have valid arguments. And we'll get into that more later, but that's kind of where I'm at today. And my opinion on it has changed in the past 10 years. And I like to think it's because I'm getting older and wiser, maybe.
Go ahead, Billy.
So I'm Billy Smith. I'm the executive director of the American Paint Horse Association. And really, this is a conversation that needs to happen. And it's really encouraging to me that this conversation is occurring across the stock horse spectrum. I'm not convinced it's a binary question whether to allow amateurs to give lessons or not. I think there's 2 critical issues that we need to have a conversation about and are having a conversation about, which is we're seeing anemic youth numbers. Youth numbers ultimately drive amateur numbers, and we need to see those numbers increase. One way to do that is to get more lesson givers into the pipeline. Now, how you do that, that's a part of the conversation. The second thing is that we know that participating, showing horses is not an inexpensive sport. So some people have the means, it's not an issue. Others, they struggle. And so I think it can be, there are a lot of different ways to tackle it. If you look at what the Olympic movement did back in 1971, really changed what amateurism means for an Olympic athlete. The NCAA has allowed athletes to provide lessons for a number of years. And of course, their new rules involving name, image, likeness have kind of revolutionized the amateur NCAA world. So I think the broader conversation for us is, let's take a look at amateurism and let's see if it's defined the way we want it to be defined, where it benefits the most number of people and it creates a future generation of exhibitors in the stock horse world.
Before we get down into our conversation, I just want to be clear for our listeners is there's no actual rule changes on the going to convention this year. I don't believe for AQHA, and I know not for APHA for this rule change proposal. Now, both associations, to my knowledge, have task force organized, that are exploring the options and digging into it and that type of thing. So I want to make sure that we're clear about that's not being voted on this year for either one of the organizations that I can speak of. And I don't have any feeling on like what the App Club is doing. Do you happen to know, Billy, if they have considered this?
I've had some conversations with some of their members, but I don't believe that they're moving in that direction yet, but I can't say for certain. I think where we are, and I think this is one of those rare opportunities that I think I can speak to some degree with for a QHA, we're having the conversation. We're asking what's the right way to do this. We're looking at various options. And because of the overlap, we're doing the best we can to figure out a way to go forward jointly so that you don't have amateurs who are trying to figure out, well, what's the APHA rule? What's the AQHA rule? And we don't create chaos in the industry.
Yeah, it's a very valid point. I've heard that expressed a few times was, what if one association decides to do it and then another doesn't, then you risk your amateur status in the other association. So that's something that would have to be considered for sure. So.
Yeah, you could have chaos really easily if you're not careful. And I don't think anybody wants that. No one wants that.
So surface level, just deep diving into what this rule change proposal possibly would help. Do you feel like it will increase the participation? Why or why not? And maybe just give like a few examples of how you feel allowing the amateurs to give lessons would help fuel that participation, if you believe so. Whoever wants to jump in.
So I was actually thinking about this last night, and in true Rachel fashion, I have a slideshow that I can share with us on this call if I need to, but I was looking at the data and I was looking at what is the actual problem that we're trying to solve? Because in my mind, my question is, are we looking to solve youth participation in stock horse breeds? Or is this something that's happening across the industry of all equine organizations, whether it's USEF or the Reining Horse Organization or Arabians or whatever you participate in? And is that because of the declining middle class in America? We've got this recession going on. Is it something that is symptomatic of something we're doing that others aren't? Or is this just the general nature of the industry? And when I looked at the numbers, as I was kind of trying to figure that out, I was looking at annual reports. I was looking at different participation numbers. And it looks like kind of across the spectrum, all the way back from the 90s into 2021, everybody is down. The only exception to that is USEF. And the only reason for that is, I don't know if you guys saw during the Olympic years, they produced a fan membership, which allowed members to get either a free or a very, very discounted rate where they could watch sports like the Olympic show jumping and eventing and everything that was going on the USEF network for a discounted price. And so I think that's a little bit of an anomaly, but everybody else is kind of decreasing. And so my question with this suggestion, this rule proposal, whatever we want to call it, is, are we identifying the right problem and are we bringing a solution that solves that problem? Because to me, it's not necessarily a resource problem, it's an allocation problem. And in my head, I've long since said that being skilled enough, being educated enough to receive remuneration for instructing others and hanging out a shingle that basically says, hey, I'm going to take on that liability of I can get you safely through a lesson. I can get you working better with your horse. To me, that makes you a professional. That makes you somebody different than like me. I travel for work 3 out of every 4 weeks. So my horses stay with the trainer because I'm lucky if I can ride once a weekend. Changing that narrative and changing what we're looking at as the problem or the solution, I think is really key and really important, because otherwise I think it's Pandora's box that we're likely to open. I hope that makes sense to everybody, because I think that's really key, is identifying, are we looking at the right problem and proposing all possible alternative solutions to fixing that problem?
Rachel, I think you very, very well described a lot of my same thoughts. I agree that we need to figure out what is the problem we're trying to solve. And I know that it's, mostly decreased participation. And how do we get people to want to come to our shows and want to participate? And I too had the same thought of, is this a show horse problem or is this an industry problem? And I don't think allowing amateurs to step into professional is going to fix the problem. The flip side to that, and this is where I struggle, is I see in our area, there's not a lot of trainers. And so how do you get, the kid down the road that loves horses and wants to learn more and do more? How do you get them involved when the trainers around here are limited, or they're already full, or, challenges like that, or maybe they don't have a truck and trailer to be able to haul 2 hours for a lesson, and that's where having an amateur available would be handy. Now, just because that would be handy, does that mean that that's the right decision to go forward to try to grow the industry? And that's where I struggle, because liability is, and this is something like when I was looking on the different forums and different discussions, liability is something that very few people talk about. And when I talk to trainers about it, that's the number one thing that they mention, is that, well, hey, that's great, but those amateurs aren't carrying liability insurance. And so I thought that was really interesting, because that comment comes from them from a business standpoint. And this is how you protect yourself, and if you don't have a business, that's how you also protect your personal property. So I think the liability part is huge that people certainly don't consider. I know nothing about that, so that's all I'll say about it. But, I think we have to look outside the box as to, if we want to increase participation, what are some other ways we can do it? Maybe amateurs are involved, but not working in a professional capacity. I was talking with one trainer, and they had said that it was difficult for them to want to support amateurs giving lessons, because they're like, this is our business. This is what we do for a living. But okay, yeah, let's let them do it too, but they don't have to have a business at it. They kind of get, they can still show as an amateur, but then still be also working as a professional. That's kind of having your cake and eat it too. When I was talking with the trainers, they also said it would be great to have their lesson programs are just insanely busy, which is great. And so they had commented like, well, it would be great if amateurs could give lessons, because that would free up some of their time. And at the same time, they were registering, but they don't have the knowledge of the rule book like trainers do. 99% of trainers hold a judge's card, so they don't have that background. I think there's a lot that a professional offers that people don't necessarily think about when they start this discussion.
I fully agree with you. Speaking of liability, I've been talking about this because it's been a topic of discussion for most of the people in my circle. And it is something that people forget. And so looking at these arguments online for the pro side, because I always try to play devil's advocate. And there are some scenarios where this would work and this would be very successful. But I think that those scenarios are few and far between. And what I mean by that is, if you run the financials, if you have a standalone liability insurance policy to give lessons and to have yourself covered, let's say it runs about $700. You can obviously get it cheaper if it's rolled into like a farm and ranch package, or you have some other kind of coverage, but $700. If you already have a horse and you're letting somebody ride like your old retired show horse, we're not taking into account any of the additional expenses. We're not taking into account any feed, any farrier care, etc. If I give beginner lessons for, say, like $40, for me to cover that $700 insurance policy, I would have to give 18 lessons just to break even. And so when I think of these scenarios, I don't think people factor in the financials of it. There's a reason lesson barns have closed up, and it's because it's a business that operates in the red unless you have a very savvy business model. I actually know several people that have kind of closed up and gone to full training only because it's a loss leader in the market. When we talk about rural areas, when we talk about, the kid that loves horses and an amateur that there's no trainers for 2 hours around, that's fantastic. But my argument would be, why wouldn't that person go pro if there is enough interest, if there is enough opportunity to profit in that area? Then theoretically that would be a great business case, because the other side of the coin is a lot of this has been talking about introductory lessons, how to pick feet, how to put on a saddle, how to walk, how to stop. If there are no trainers within a 2-hour radius, let's just use that example, you're only going to get that prospect so far. And then you're going to be right back in the same situation of they don't have a truck and trailer. They can't go to anybody else. They have limited funds. They can't haul all around and keep a horse with a trainer to go to some of the bigger shows. So we get into this cyclical kind of spiral where, we might have solved the initial problem of having a little bit of good instruction initially, but once that person outgrows that introductory lesson, then what? And so I think that's where my challenge comes in thinking about this. Is the only way this would make sense from what I've been able to gather and look at financially is if there is a trainer that says, hey, I have some horses that would be great lesson horses. And Rachel, I would love for you to come teach my walk trot lessons on the weekends. That way I can focus on my business and you can focus on these beginner lessons. I would have no outlay of liability. I'd be added to their policy. I would just make a little bit of extra cash. But at that point, what differentiates me from an assistant trainer? The other big thing is, how do we police this? We've already got people left and right that are like, oh, so-and-so is breaking the rules. So-and-so I don't think is being fair about what they're doing. If we add in this layer and I'm the assistant coach somewhere that's giving walk trot lessons, to me, that blurs that line even further. And I have no idea how we would do any enforcement there when we're not doing enough enforcement today. Does that kind of make sense?
100%. And I think that's a really good point of just mentioning, it's hard to enforce things now. The water might get pretty murky, but I'd love to hear Billy's thoughts on it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so I think there's some really good points, but let me dice it up a little bit. I think we need to make a clear distinction between lesson giving and training. There's a difference. And before we get a kid, and I'm thinking more in terms of kids, but when you read the data on youth sports participation, it's very clear. Those decisions get made very early in life, very early. And so if we're not getting very young kids, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 involved in horses, the likelihood they'll get involved is pretty small. So we need to keep that in mind. And that is a conversation going on in all youth sports. The baseball guys are talking about it because kids are deciding, unlike an old guy like me who played as a kid 3 months of baseball, 3 months of basketball, 3 months of track or something like that. That doesn't happen anymore. So it's really critical that we touch youth early and get them engaged as early as we can. One of the things that lesson givers provide is the ability to come in contact with a horse for someone who does not own a horse. And I think it's really important that as we progress through this conversation, we think about that group of people. It's really difficult. It's a real easy thing for a family to go to a trainer and find out I've got to spend, X $1,000s on a horse. I need to board it there or haul it in. I got to buy a trailer, et cetera, et cetera. Their decision becomes, I really like soccer. That's a better option for me. What we need to figure out is how we as an industry can create lesson givers so that kids get lessons. Now, some of those kids will not advance. They won't buy a horse. They won't move on. But that doesn't mean that's not valuable to our industry. It's very valuable to our industry. And I'll give you just sort of a quick illustration. We come in contact with people at the political level, USDA and other levels, all the time, who make policy about livestock and horses and things like, who know nothing, zero, have never had an experience with horses in their lives. So this is, while we focus on the competition, the context is, how do we solve two fundamental issues? We're seeing shrinking numbers is one thing we're seeing, and we're seeing the cost of owning a horse going up. So those are important things that will impact our industry. You mentioned USEF. I'm not super familiar with their rules, but I am familiar enough to know that they have opened up amateur lesson giving as long as it's within the confines of a trainer. I think if you really sat and talked to most trainers that I know, not a whole lot of them are giving lessons. That's a difficult thing in their business model to do. So I think those are all considerations that need to go into the conversation. I think everything I've heard here is very valid. There hasn't been anything anyone said that's not valid. But I think it would help us if, as we move forward as organizations, to not think in terms of a binary conversation. It's how can we get access to lesson givers for kids who want to ride horses and may not own a horse and may not ever own a horse. How can we do that? And then how can we reduce the cost? And that's one way we can reduce the cost, is allow people to do that. That's what the NCAA does. If you're a collegiate basketball player, you can give lessons and you can make money giving lessons. It doesn't impact negatively on coaches or anything like that. It's something that they've done. The Olympic movement had to do the very same thing because they knew what was going to happen. Other nations were going to allow that kind of amateur thing, and they couldn't police it. They made that decision. Again, as I mentioned, 1971 is when they made that decision. So again, I don't think it's a binary decision. I think it's a conversation we need to have about how can we do that and how can we make it a little more affordable for people, or give them a way in which they can participate and open up the opportunities for youth. There are not a lot of places to send a kid whose mom and dad, let's take the mom and dad who have no horse background, and they're thinking about sending their kid to lessons like they might think about giving their kid piano lessons or something. Those are the people we scare off. And they may have the means to buy a horse. They may have the means to buy a trailer and a truck, but they're not going to start out at that spot. They're going to start out, is this little Susie's fad? She just read a few magazines. She likes horses. She's watched some cartoon. Or is this something she's serious about? Well, before I invest thousands and thousands of dollars into a horse, let's find out if this is the real deal or not. And I think that's part of the conversation we need to have is, are we satisfying that? Because the trend today is not sustainable. It's just not sustainable. So we need to figure out creative ways of making that happen. And I think this is is not the only way. It is part of a larger conversation, but I think it's an important one.
I just seen that we had our last guest jump in, so I'll let him kind of introduce himself real quick. And we just had everyone kind of tell us your involvement in the industry and a brief yes, no for the amateur rule proposal that's not getting voted on. As Jenna mentioned, we're not voting on it this year, but potentially next year.
Hey, my name's Dustin. Sorry for late arrival. I had the time mixed up. My apologies. Currently, I am on the IEA Executive Directors Board, and I coach an IEA team. For those of you that are unfamiliar maybe with IEA and YETA, we have both teams in our barn. It is the catch ride system that focuses on youth, although both do have adult programs now. The focus is definitely on youth entering into the equine industry. It's a leveled system, so we take in the green as grass people, green as grass students, and it works all the way up to open level riders, which essentially would equate to a higher end youth rider that's showing APHA, AQHA. We've had kids like Alexa Maxwell, Grant Maston, pretty big name players in that open level. So it's a pretty cool ladder system that, gives kids that opportunity. I heard a person before speaking about getting those kids in on the grassroots level, absolutely gets them there and gives them that glimpse of what the highest end is, place for parents to kind of hash things out as well. We do have a few boarders, trainers here on the farm as well, but my big focus is my team, 22 members strong this year roughly in Lansing, Michigan. We're a little south of there. So yeah, that's a little about me. If I'm for or against, I actually would ride the fence on it. I don't know that I have a stance at the moment. I think there is this hang up amongst people that I hear talk about it, that there aren't enough connections to grassroots level riding. I would probably agree with that in the fact that I don't think there are connections, but there absolutely are facilities that are not only doing the hunter end, that's their world, that's been their world for a long time, leasing horses and getting people into the industry. But we are something like, I think we're like 800 members strong. So I would say in our area, in the Midwest area, there's at least 15 teams that kind of work with those grassroots level people. I think it probably gets a little bit muddy to regulate if you let amateurs go on, but that's kind of a nutshell why I kind of stand in the middle. I'm not necessarily for or against it.
So one of the other things, and I go back to it's not a resource problem, it's an allocation problem, is we have these things like IEA. We have, is it YITA or YITA? Sorry if I pronounced that wrong, but we have these organizations, and both organizations have adult programs. I think that there's two things we need to look at. One is we need to make horses more accessible. So when we talk about an organization like IEA, one of my very best friends, so further background on me, I've been on the board of directors for the North Texas Hunter Jumper Club for the last 10 years. So I'm very well connected with the hunters in this area. And lesson programs are thriving. And if you can make something profitable for trainers, they will do it. But you have to have it set up to where it makes business sense for them. And so I think the reason that it hasn't worked previously is because it doesn't make business sense, at least in the stock horse breeds that I've been involved with, or the stock horse barns. What I mean by that is one of my friends owns a facility. She has an IEA team. That IEA team is mandated to take at least one lesson a week with her to be on the show team. When they show, it's not overly expensive for the riders. I want to say maybe $60 to show in the division for the weekend. And that trainer has a consistent stream of income. That child is able to get involved. They don't have to own the horse. They don't have to lease the horse. They don't have to pay a transfer fee. And that's a big thing that I think could be a solution rather than giving amateurs carte blanche access to get paid for lessons, because I think that is just Pandora's box and it's a bad idea to open it. I would think that we would go the direction of, hey, I have a really nice horse and I have my friend who has never shown in an APHA show before. Could my friend come out and show in the amateur walk trot hunter under saddle on my horse for the weekend? We could split cost. We could divvy up cost. It would make it more affordable for her. It would make it more affordable for me. She doesn't have to own the horse. And I think that's a much better way to get people involved. If we're talking accessibility to the industry, not having the obligation of buying a truck and trailer and buying a so many $1,000 animal is really the way to lower the barriers to entry for a big swath of the population. The other thing that I think is interesting is IEA pushing their adult program. I actually am pretty heavily involved with that as well, because I don't know about you guys, but I'm in my mid-30s. I don't have kids. I don't plan on having kids. So I have a dual income. I have 7 horses, 3 are in training. I spend a lot of money in this industry. And I have a lot of friends that are getting out of college. They don't have plans for kids in the near future, but they have disposable income. They would like to be involved. They see my pictures on social media. They see my horses. They want that on-ramp too. So while I think youth are very important, I think that amateurs just and adults in general, people that are coming back into things with money throughout their lives, have the opportunity to get involved with our organizations, but we have to be able to make it, air quotes, affordable for them by not having them tied into these huge leases and transfers and ownership where they're investing thousands of dollars. If I could bring somebody along to a show for a weekend to show in a couple of classes, think of how great that would be. I know our local North Texas hunter jumper shows, we haven't really seen a dip in participation because those kids can bring whatever lesson horse they show. There's no ownership requirement. They can show in whatever division they want. They get ribbons out of it. If they want to compete for year-end prizes, they can, but they don't have to. There's no obligation to do more than what they're willing to, be comfortable with and what they have the budget to do.
I have a follow-up to what you're saying. I'm co-author on a rule change proposal that's getting voted on at this year's APHA convention to remove the ownership requirements for novice amateurs, to try and break down the barrier to where we can get new people to come show without having to own the horse and not have to file paperwork and with the show office. That doesn't apply to the World Show, which is a different subject. So just want to say that it's a very valid point that we're trying to figure out the ownership side to let people come show without having to go buy a show horse was one. And then I have a follow-up question for Dustin and then one for Billy after that is, Dustin, I know you maintain a lesson string of yourself, and there's a lot of people that say it's not profitable. Trainers can't have a lesson string. It's too expensive just to have lesson horses. So how do you make it work? What's kind of your business model and that type of thing?
The business model that we follow, roughly, without getting too deep into financials, every one of my kids pays a membership fee. I think maybe one of the big hangups is people think that they have to, if they have 20 kids, man, they better have at least 10 horses or more than that. And it does become a lot of a time management piece as well. But I have 22 kids and we manage 4 lesson horses. The other part of that makes it very feasible for me and is something IEA and both Yetta are helpful with is I get a bunch of my horses donated. So the initial cost of purchase is not even there. Sometimes means that you have to do a little maintenance, but 4 horses can service 20 kids relatively easily. And then we just do that. So it's not necessarily a lesson package. I call it a subscription package. If you're on my team monthly, you pay me. It includes lessons, but right up front, I tell those kids and parents that they're responsible for the maintenance of those horses once they enter that program. Over 20 kids, 4 horses is nothing really.
And then Billy, what's your comments on the policing side from the associations on how the association could even begin to keep track of something like this?
Well, the policing of amateurism is complicated anyway. I mean, it's complicated today. And most organizations like APHA, we don't have an enforcement arm. We don't have police. Most organizations are self-policing. But that is to say, it's not impossible because we certainly discipline a certain number of people every year. But it's complicated. And that's one of the I'm glad you mentioned, Jenna, the rule change proposal that you submitted, because I was going to bring that up, that while we don't have any kind of a rule change related to amateurs giving lessons, we do have a rule change proposal that might help with the ownership provision, which I think is an important step. To respond to Rachel a little bit, what Rachel's describing is essentially what I'm describing. There's not a magic bullet here that just solves all the problems. We have to address it in multiple ways. And I think the amateur question is one way to have that conversation. Again, USEF has opened that through, but they've done it in a very restrictive way, which I think could be a very viable approach as well. Their model seems to be working pretty well. And it gives access to lesson givers so that those trainers are lesson givers often, but a lot of them are horse trainers. That's what they want to do. They want to train horses. And that's their business model. I would say that APHA has a very close relationship with IEA. I've given a horse myself to a facility that has an IEA team and lesson givers. It's actually a really good place to contribute a horse that's, not going to go down the road anymore, but still has some try in him and still has some ability to help a beginner out. So I think that's critical important to this conversation, is not to get locked into this for or against thing. It's, in fact, we did a survey of some of our members that our task force is working on. And basically it was about half were opposed and the other half were for some semblance of amateur lesson giving. And then within that, it was a wide range. It was a really wide range of what people were willing to explore. So it's a divided camp. But what I try to tell some of our folks is, let's not make this divisive. It doesn't need to be divisive. We're asking questions that will fuel the future of the industry. And if we're really smart and we're thoughtful and we look at the whole range of issues and not get tied up into this for or against, I think we'll come up with some pretty good solutions that will move us down the road. The one thing, though, that I think is really critical to keep in mind, because most of us operate at the horse show kind of level, is we can never forget about the young kids. How do we get them involved? Because if we don't get them early, the chances, the odds go way against us that we'll ever get them. So I think it's that really young kid, particularly the young kid whose parents are not very horsey. They don't know much about horses. We can't just throw them into this sticker shock universe, because they'll go away. They'll play soccer, play baseball. They'll do something else. I think that's an important feature that gets lost sometimes, is we just get hyper-focused on showing. All of you have a story about the first horse you ever had, or the first lesson you ever took, or your first ride. So we've got that on-ramp is critically important.
I think you bring up a really good point there. One of the other discussions I was having recently was the accreditation process to give lessons in the US. We don't have one. You know, the British Horse Society has testing that you have to go through before you hang the shingle out, before you can take on that liability. And that's something I've seen over my years is occasionally we'll get people that want to be a trainer and they put kids in dangerous situations. They overmount them, they get them scared, and those people leave and they never come back to the industry. Aspect that I think we have to consider is, if we do expand the breadth of who is going to instruct these green as grass folks, how do we make sure that they're going to give them a good experience so that they're going to want to continue and not put them in a situation where they're never going to want to come back to horses?
I have just a thought clicked in my head from reading some of these forum discussions, and it ties into two aspects, I think. So the liability portion, if you're accepting money for the service, technically you would then become a business. So liability is going to be something that I feel like amateurs would have to have in this situation. But what happens if we take out, they're going to receive money for their service, and we go more towards building like a volunteer type program for the amateurs to help these green as grass beginners? I personally am an amateur, never would want to become a trainer. There's just no way I could do it. But I do feel in my 20 years of riding, I might be able to help a green as grass rider, but I wouldn't want any money for that service. I would just want to help them. I don't know if and I know one of our questions that we sent out to you guys was, what are some of the other ideas that you may have? But I just wanted to throw that one out there as I was thinking about it. Ashley, I know you had a comment that you wanted to make.
Yeah, and I think you make a really good point. I don't know enough about APHA or AQHA to know what they're doing at the grassroots level. What programs do they have? What grants do they have available? What support do they have for people that are maybe wanting to get into a lesson program, whether it outside of, the amateur versus the professional? Because that's something in our area that we need. We need support from bigger associations to make that happen. And I think we would get more benefit out of that and see an increase of numbers in the youth, not even necessarily showing, but just getting into the horse industry and kind of fueling their passion for horses. If people had resources, 4-H, for example, used to be, the horse project used to be huge, and the numbers have dwindled so immensely. And that's for a number of reasons. But Are there associations that are supporting 4-H? Because those 4-H leaders, that's a lot of volunteer basis. It's not even necessarily trainers. It's just people that are somehow affiliated with horses that are coaching these kids or being a leader. I guess that kind of funnels into the third aspect of like, what ideas do we have? And it's like, I would really challenge these breed associations to somehow support getting some ideas off the ground at the grassroots level. Is there some way they can support 4-H? Is there some way they can support the programs that Dustin is involved in? And maybe they do already. I think it's really important to start showing up at that grassroots level, because I know when I think about AQHA, I don't think about beginners. When I think of the horses, just AQHA as an association in terms of showing, I don't think of it as a grassroots level, and maybe some do. But I think when we talk about trying to get the youth of our industry involved, these programs need help. And I think with these bigger associations, they just have more resources available. So how can we help them to be successful? How can we help people? I mean, I could list off people that give lessons right now, but they need more support, whether it be in actual horses or facilities, or they do it part-time because they don't have enough resources available to be able for them to do it profitably. Some resources like that, or even for people to be able to work with a trainer. Maybe they're like, well, I want to give lessons, but I don't feel like I have enough knowledge. I have some knowledge. Are there programs out there where you can apprentice? Like the NRHA has a program where you can give up your non-pro status for a year and basically apprentice. And then at the end of the year, if you're like, nope, this is not my cup of tea, you can go back to being a non-pro. But in that year, you're paired with another trainer to kind of learn the ropes and see if this is really what you want to do. And I'd really be curious to see if they have a lot of participation, because at the end of the day, that's great if you want amateurs to give lessons. But what happens when that kid now does want to show and now they want to work with a trainer? I think you're going to cause some division between trainers being professionals doing this for a living, but okay, amateurs can give lessons, great. But now that amateur has someone that wants to go to a trainer and they're like, well, you've been calling yourself a professional all these years. I think there's going to be some gray area there. I mean, that's talking about it in very plain language versus kind of having some processes, some rules in place, things like that. But we also don't want to lose the trainers we have. I think what programs can we put into place that would potentially increase going from maybe just a lesson program into training? How can we facilitate growth there also? I kind of went on a tangent, but it's definitely a wormhole that we go down when we start discussing these things. It's so multifaceted.
Mm-hmm.
Actually, let me respond to a couple of those things. I think you're right that there are lots of programs out there that need support. We don't have the resources to do all of that, but we do have some resources. And so one of the things that has, I think, been very beneficial is we created a product called Horse IQ, which we've got tremendous 4-H involvement in. The Horse IQ product allows anyone at any level, it's a leveled kind of system, to go in and learn about different classes. It's a platform for that, how the judges are doing the classes, how they're interpreting the rules. But it's also got other material in it too. And longer term, you were talking about liability and things like that. One of the things that we'll be rolling out over time is just some simple things, like if you're going to own a horse business, how do you do the accounting? What are the things to consider? How do you deal with, how do you manage depreciation on things you buy? And so there's some opportunity there. I think that's an important facet, but I also think organizations like ours, we're very closely associated with IEA. We do quite a bit with them. I think that's important too. But I also think there are very smart and savvy trainers out there today already who have created an orbit around them of lesson givers who can then funnel to them, particularly kids who get more accomplished and want to step up and do something more aggressively, be more deeply involved. There's a way to do that where everyone wins. And I think the USEF model is tailored in that direction, where the trainer has this satellite of amateurs around giving lessons. Once that normally kid wants to advance and really move forward and start showing, then they get passed along. So there's different models out there, but we encourage folks to go take a look at our horse IQ model. It's a really in-depth, detailed kind of system. It has a certification system for trainers, for show managers as well. It's a really good system. And that's my one unashamed
little plug, but it's worth it.
Little bit of plug for Horse IQ. So
yeah.
No, that's terrific. That sounds like a very, very good resource that you need to plug.
The other thing we haven't really touched on is the membership feedback and the participation, the feedback of trainers. I know specifically this rule change that we're kind of having the roundtable on today, the overwhelming feedback I've seen has been against it. Most of the membership, this is why it hasn't gotten voted on the last couple of years when it has actually been on the docket, is because the people don't want this. And most of the people I've spoken to, just personally, obviously my personal connections do not represent the industry as a whole, but they don't want to go show as an amateur and spend their hard-earned money to go show against people who make a living or make money off of this. That's always been the hard and fast line. So I know this conversation is much bigger. Obviously, that's the primary topic. But Jenna, I'll be interested to see how that rule change goes and kind of how that gets passed through, because I think as a beginning step, allowing people access without the requirements of ownership, without the requirements of a huge outlay of money at the beginning, I'd be interested to see what that does from a data perspective, rather than changing the basic definitions we've all operated on forever.
I agree. I think we're hopeful that people will understand the need for it to allow, and it is just the novice. So, it's not regular amateurs by any means. The only real pushback that's been voiced on it to me so far was they were concerned about the show records for the horse and how the points may or may not follow that horse. So was one person's concern, and that's kind of a different topic altogether. So we won't get into that. I'm interested to see what will happen too. Dustin, do you have any input here on the last things discussed?
So what I'm hearing, and probably why I am so on the fence about it, is that this is such a multifaceted thing. And I think what really drives my decision making, and I think you would have a more definite line as opposed to a 50-50 line with the membership, with the constituency, is there's not much metrics behind it at the moment. We're realizing that we want to get youth in at the green as grass level, but how do we do that? Well, there's the amateur piece of letting them give lessons. There's the connection piece with programs that are already going on. There's building programs that we already have. And the thing that I think is missing to really nail the coffin is what has each one of those things individually produced, right? And I can only speak for IEA a little bit. We're very consistently 10% membership increase every year in the last 6 years that I've done it. That does seem like a viable way to make a connection with those green as grass people. APHA has done a wonderful job of creating a connection with IEA. We're going to have our national finals there. Those kids will see the highest level. Those parents will see the highest level of competition in the nation. I think that's a beautiful and wonderful thing. I kind of just stay on the fence a little bit because I think there is merit in trying to find more instructors. I don't know that I have personally, and this is just me and my experience, but I don't know that I have an amateur in the barn that would want to teach kids. They see the 20 kids come through the barn while they're working on their own horses, and they always look at me and say, how the heck are you doing that? So, I don't know that opening that rule up would affect many people, and that can be looked at as a positive and a negative as well, until that I think USEF has opened it up, and APHA, AQHA would be wise to maybe sit down for a second and just let those numbers roll in and then ask them questions and see how in a more permanent situation it has affected their association. I think there's lots of great things happening, and I think that's the hard part about saying what's the right thing to do is there are cool things happening around us now. There are connections being made. I don't know that opening it up to amateurs is the right thing, but I don't know that it's the wrong thing either.
Does anyone have closing thoughts? I know we've taken about an hour of everyone's time so far. Is there anything that you would like to state, maybe throw out any ideas that you would have regardless of this rule change proposal to try to bring in more? I think our main focus is youth in this conversation, but just in general, as Rachel pointed out, there's adults that would like to join. Any ideas that you would like to throw out or closing thoughts before we wrap up?
I mean, I think it's just important to look at the data. I think it's important to not make a change that we can't roll back based on gut feeling. I think there are some steps that we can take as organizations that don't put us in such a risky position should they fail. Obviously, the more risk with anything in business, the more risk, the longer time you take to make a decision. And so if it's something that's fairly low risk, like Jenna's proposal to have novice amateurs not need to own a horse, I think that's pretty low risk. I think that's something that is a great idea to see what that does to the numbers. What does that change over the course of the next year? How do we put together something that fiscally benefits the existing trainers that are out there? How do we support those people that are currently sponsoring IEA and YITA teams? How do we get them the resources that they need? How do we get 4-H leaders the things that they need? And I think that all of that should probably come before a rule change that challenges the very definition of an entire class of exhibitors.
I think you summarized that really, really well, Rachel. I think when we look at making a rule change, we really have to consider if the reason why we want to do the rule change, if that's going to fix the problem we've identified. And that is what's hard about this, is that it's not linear. There are so many facets to this, and changing the rule might help, in this area, which that would be a good thing, but then is it detrimental in another? And that's where you have to weigh if the rule change, if the benefits outweigh, the problems that it could cause. And I think there are so many options out there. And I mean, there's been a ton of great ideas just on this call about how we start getting, some of those grassroots people involved. Maybe we need to dig into that a little further before just heading towards a rule change.
I'll jump in here real quick. Myself, I am a voting director for APHA. I am on the amateur committee with APHA, and I'm also on the youth participation task force with APHA. So of course, this is something of a subject that I'm very passionate about and very involved in. And I think it's very nuanced. It's very hard to, I think, for the general membership to consider how nuanced it really is. When you get presented with a rule change to let amateurs receive payment for something, everybody freaks out. And I still feel like that's where we're at. But that being said, since I do have voting privileges, I do have to represent the membership in a way, so I see both sides of this. And I think it's something that everybody needs to expand their mindset around. Not saying you need to be for or against this rule change proposal, but it's just, you need to start getting kind of out of our comfort zones a little bit, and nothing changes if nothing changes. And what's happening right now is not working. Our industry is not in a healthy spot if we keep, going this track. So I just beg everybody to consider all ideas, all options, bring them forth, have conversations, have debates, do it intelligently and logically, and let's see what we all can brainstorm together, because I don't think this rule change or another rule change, one in itself, is ever going to fix the problem. That's just my thoughts.
And Jenna, I have to commend you and, really point out to all of the listeners that you saw a gap in something and you took the steps to fill that gap. And I'm referring to, you started kind of collecting a database of people that give lessons. Who do you give lessons to? What level? That form was very all-encompassing. And we need people to start doing things like that. If you see a need, there's nowhere to look to see what trainers are in my area, who gives lessons, and you kind of jumped in with both feet. And I just think that's awesome, because anybody can do that. You don't have to have a certain position somewhere. You happen to sit on these boards, but you don't have to. And I think just encouraging people to get involved is huge.
Yeah, I think people are quick to be Facebook warriors a lot of times, especially in the horse industry. We all operate on Facebook, which is great. That's how we keep in touch with each other. But also, if you're constantly complaining or against something, but then unwilling to do anything about it to move things forward, then you're not providing any value to the industry either.
Actions speak louder than words.
Well, I think, Jenna, just to close, I don't want to sound like a broken record, but the reality is, I think what's been presented here, and I really commend you for putting this podcast together, really tells the story. The story is there's not a single magic bullet. It's not going to happen. But there are things we can do, and we need to have the conversation. And what I tell our folks is stay calm, get involved, have a conversation, think about alternatives. That really very important idea may come in right field somewhere. So there are lots of ways to improve the number of amateurs in competition. There's lots of ways to get people to reach out to our younger audiences and get them involved. And I think we need to explore them all. And I don't think we need to be afraid to explore them all. And I don't think we need to be afraid to look at all kinds of different options and see where we can end up. I think one of the greatest and healthiest things that's going on right now is that this conversation is going on. We rocked along a long time watching these numbers do what they're doing and not doing anything really substantively about it. So the fact that this conversation is going on is important. The fact that APHA and AQHA and other groups have task forces looking at it, that's critically important. And I expect that we'll get some positives outcomes out of those at some point in the future. And I think it's going to be because of people like you all who get involved, as opposed to, as you mentioned, the keyboard warriors who aren't directly involved in solving the problem. So I commend you all for being a part of the solution and trying to find solutions that will make this industry that we love flourish in the future.
Dustin, you got any closing thoughts for us?
Not really anything that I haven't already said or has previously been mentioned by everybody else here. Like I said, I think it's a multifaceted thing that there's a lot of things that we can do to bring kids, to bring adults into the organizations. And I'm anxious to see if one stands out more than the other, because right now it just seems like there's a lot of irons in the fire, and I'm excited about that. That's a cool thing for our industry.
Definitely. I know Jenna and I definitely appreciate everyone's time today. As Billy has said, conversation is key. I think just keeping us all together. Obviously, I think we can all agree we want the same thing. We want our industry to keep going. And this is just a way for conversation to be brought and see different viewpoints and maybe learn something you didn't know, change your opinion, whichever way. But it's definitely, Dustin said, you're splitting the fence. You're not for it or against it. It's just kind of how we're going to get to the other side to increase that participation. Jenna, do you have anything else?
One little thing, and Liz is going to laugh at me when I say this. I preach this on Facebook too. I'm like, we're all trying to get more people into this industry. We all want the same thing. No matter what level you show at, participate at, we're all trying to, get there. But it goes a long way if people would just be nice and friendly and smile at people at these freaking horse shows and welcome them. I mean, that costs nothing. This has come up several times. And I just remind people, it's just be a decent human and engage with people. And I think that would go a long way to making our industry seem a little less intimidating too. So I'm going to take this moment to harp on that one last time. That's all.
All right. Well, we appreciate your guys' input and your thoughts, and especially your time on a Sunday. But yeah, we appreciate it. And I think our listeners will enjoy this discussion, and we'll see what sort of conversation it brings up.
Yeah. Thank you, guys.
Great. Thank you all. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Have a great rest of the Sunday.
All right, that'll be your class. Bring them in and line them up.